Alrighty, guys. So recently, I've been going down the Reddit rabbit hole of looking into RPG game design, and I've been trying to figure out why I like certain games, why I don't like other games, and what aspects of different games I like. And I stumbled upon this idea called GNS theory, which is basically trying like a way to sort of place different games in reference to like the different aspects of like the three different things that RPGs try to accomplish. One of them being gamism, the other being simulationism, and then narrativism. So the gamism is the idea of like how much does this game try to actually be fun and have like meaningful and different decisions that you make that will depend on like the actual given circumstances and the numbers involved in those different things. Um, then you've got simulationism, which is the idea of like recreating the real world and like the idea of trying to make things happen in the game make sense, at least like when they correspond to how that would go in the real world. And it's like that verisimilitude sort of idea. Then we've got narrativism, which is the idea of like how well does the game allow you to like tell a story? Like, is it dramatic? Is there like good pacing? And does it concern itself at all with different like conflicts and resolutions and how these are like entertaining aspects for the players involved? And concerned about like characters and character development and all that stuff. So I figured I would just like take some of the games and decide where I'm going to just put them on this triangle sort of spectrum and discuss like why I think this game belongs there and what aspects of are like good or bad about going into like that side of the spectrum. So first off, I'm just gonna pop a quick D. Let's make that look a little better. D and D. I'm gonna put this right near the top of the list of gamism. Is like D&D really is mostly just a war game with some RPG elements tacked onto it. It's how it was designed back in ye good old days of 73 or 70, whatever it was invented. It's basically just different war games, and they just, the good old chainmail and that, and then just adding a little bit of like just the idea of, well, what if we just focused on one single person instead of the entire army of your war game? And the gamism aspect, like everything when you read through the D&D rulebook, 90% of what it has to say is all involving combat and the numbers that are associated with different spells and abilities and attacks, and everything serves to like how this works in the game, at least for the most part. In the like dichotomy of fiction first versus mechanics first, D&D I think is very far on the end of mechanics first. As in like you say like, okay, so I've got 30 feet of movement and an action, so I need to determine what I'm doing within the bounds of the game, and saying like, okay, I'm going to walk forward here, and then with my action I'm going to take the attack action with my longsword, and then I'm going to roll and then add these bonuses, see the results, and then we can determine the fiction. Then we can determine the narrative after we know the actions you're taking and the results of your dice. And then we can say, okay, so that you attack with your longsword, and because you got this number, this thing happens. You lop off the orc's arm and deal this number of damage to him. So gamism, I think it's got some good things going for it. Obviously, like, well, for one, like, I think just newer players in general, they're kind of just used to the idea of board games. They probably have played like at the very least Monopoly or something, where they are just like rolling dice and then things happen based off of those dice results. So I think it's like a relatively like the very deep gamist idea, easy for like people to transition to if they're coming from just having played board games in the past. But like if your concern is with telling interesting stories, it can be a little lacking in that aspect, and that the game wasn't designed to tell interesting stories. It was designed for you to go into a dungeon and attack a monster. And also, it feels very fair, which is a good thing. Like when you get into a combat with orcs and you beat them, it feels that you can like that you've done that through the tactics that you've used because of the different abilities that you have and how you used them. So yeah, the gamist idea, I don't think it's strictly like there's anything wrong with it. I think it does sometimes become frustrating when you do, or like when people start getting more interested into the narrative. And like one of the main examples I can think of for the gamist idea versus the narrativist idea and how those two things would handle a situation is the classic, like I'm playing a barbarian, so I want to run up and swing my sword and chop off all three of these goblins' heads. And the gamist idea, well, in order to do that, you need to have cleave. And if you don't have that ability called cleave, even though like there's no reason why a strong barbarian couldn't like in the world take their sword and swing and cut off three goblins' heads. You can't do that because you don't have the game mechanic that allows you to do that. And if you do just let the player do that and you start ignoring cleave and the like fact that people would need that, then things start breaking apart when you're like, okay, well then what's the point in a player taking cleave if there's circumstances where they're just allowed to do it anyway and not even have it. And you start disincentivizing people to like stick to the mechanics, and like the game just starts like you don't have a lot of room to play around with different scenes because everything needs to be within the bounds of the games or the mechanics, or else like the things start kind of falling apart. And again, just because D&D, I've placed it high on the gamism, I'm going like off of strictly how the game is intended to be run, rules as written and all that. If you just rule of cool everything, then you can play D&D in an extremely narrativist style. But if you start doing that, then you're not like at some point when you rule of cool every single thing players are doing, and you're just ignoring the rules of D&D, at some point you're not playing D&D anymore. But then I don't know, that might be getting a little too philosophical. Okay. Then on the far simulationist side, I'm going to pop down GURPS, the generic universal role-playing system. GURPS, I think, has a lot of things going for it. Specifically, really, really love the character creation in GURPS. You can make people that feel very real. You can have people that they have certain likes and dislikes, and they like and dislike things to varying degrees. They can be like intolerant towards some of these things and then be totally addicted to other things. And skills, there's the longest skill list of any game ever in GURPS. There's like a million different skills, and people can be very specifically good at many different things. It just makes for like really, really fleshed out characters, and that I think is great. But then the game itself, it does not care about the narrative. It does not care about the story in the absolute slightest. GURPS will have you make checks, and the most routine, basic thing will come out as a result of your check every single time. And just kind of like in real life, mundane sort of situations only ever become interesting or crazy or like narratively worth becoming a story and telling about later. There's only like a 1 in a million chance of that happening in real life. Well, then there's only a 1 in a million chance of that happening in GURPS, which not great, or at least, it definitely does what it says, and that it like simulates real life as well as a game possibly can, which can also become kind of annoying because everything is so incredibly interweaved and connected and interacts with other aspects of the game to such a specific degree that when you start deciding to like take things out and messing with it, they can kind of like snowball with the amount of effects that has. The example I always like to go to is the charge impact velocity, which I think any reasonable human at all ever would never consider, like having to figure out like someone's velocity and their acceleration and the mass of the object every time they like make a cavalry charge, because it's just the amount of detail you can go into in GURPS. You could to make any single one action take an hour if you wanted it to be as exact and as perfectly accurate to real life as you possibly could be. So yeah, like if you just ignore like charge velocity, then like yeah, you kind of are gonna have to do that if you don't want actions to take a million years. But then things start breaking down when you're like, well, the reason that this thing's weight matters and the reason why you improve these certain advantages are to have an effect on these specific checks, and if we start ignoring these specific checks, well, now this advantage is becoming less valuable. And I don't know, it's almost reminds me of like Factorio, when you have the video game where you have like a super complicated spaghetti mess of factory chains, and then like one little thing in the middle can break and just your entire factory shuts down until you figure out how to fix it. That's kind of what GURPS reminds me of. Yeah, the playing of it can be a little tiresome and grueling at points, but I do love how specific it gets with the character creation and how it makes every single little facet of character creation actually matter. Like how it makes, if you are intolerant to goblins, and whether or not your intolerance is 1 to 10, and each of those different levels will have goblins react to you, or you will react to goblins in a corresponding way according to your specific disadvantage regarding goblins. I love that it really makes every aspect of your character actually feel meaningful. Okay, so I'm going to put in narrativism powered by the apocalypse. This is a game I have never ever played in my entire life. So I'm just going to... I've read a bit of Dungeon World, and that's... I'm just going to start making up a lot of points about this game that I really have like zero evidence and zero data to back up. I'm just going off of like the one PDF that I wrote. For one, this is like a very, very simple game. The whole like PDF and the rules are like 10 pages long, and character sheets are 1 page, and you only have 5 stats, and every single thing is just 2 dice. You roll them, and then you add your 1 score. It is extremely, extremely simple. It is really not concerned about being like a game or simulating real life to any extent at all. Which has led a lot of people to say that it is very good for new players, which I could definitely see. There's not a lot of numbers or rules or mechanics or anything for you to have to know. You just have to figure out these like 5 numbers, and then you're set. And on the other side, like I well, I don't really care for the character creation in Powered by the Apocalypse. At least what I've seen of it compared to like GURPS. Like in Powered by the Apocalypse, you just say like race, class, I'm human fighter and my bond, I'm loyal to my king. Whereas like D&D, at least like in 5e, I should say, you got your bond, ideal, flaw, yada yada. Powered by the Apocalypse, you can be done creating your character in like 3 words. You can just say like I'm a human fighter loyal to my king or whatever. And if you decide that you are intolerant to goblins and Powered by the Apocalypse, if you decide that your character hates goblins, it's really up to like you and the DM to sort of ever determine when that ever comes up. And like you can kind of you can ignore it when it's convenient for you. Whereas like in GURPS, you if you don't like goblins and if you have the hates goblins disadvantage, then that will very specifically have an effect on dice rolls concerning goblins, and it will have an in-game effect. Whereas in Powered by the Apocalypse, I feel like this very much so more relies upon all the players and the DM trusting each other to all want to tell the same kind of story. Which, when I think about Powered by the Apocalypse in that sort of sense, I can only imagine like, well, how can this game be both really good for new players if it relies so much upon everyone being on the same page and the whole group working really well together? So I feel like you can't really work well together if you're new because you don't really know what kind of stories these people like to tell and how exactly they like to tell these stories and what they think should be possible within whatever given means. And on the other hand, like if you do know all that stuff, there's a very good chance that you're not new, that you figured all this stuff out by playing with this group for a while. There's just lots of stuff empowered by the Apocalypse that's like, if you are in an important location, you've got +1 to this, that, or the other, or when you try to make a move when you have the upper hand in a combat, or yeah, just weird stuff that's kind of like very, very vague, which like I don't know exactly. Like I assume the DM gets to determine if this location is important or not, and if this bonus from this ability like applies or if it doesn't, which I could see how that sort of exists to promote dialogue between the players and DM to figure out like, well, is this important? Is this location important? Or like, I have a +1 when I'm in a sketchy situation. It's like, okay, so like, is this situation sketchy? Or like, I have a bonus to complete complicated problems. And it's like, okay, so like, is this problem complicated? What decision are we coming to that? Which I could see how is useful for narrative games because it's really making you think. Not from, in D&D, an ability is like, if you are being attacked by a giant of size large or larger with a melee attack, you have a +4 bonus to your armor class. And it's just like, okay, that has nothing to say. Like, maybe narratively it might say something about how your character deals with giants to some extent. Do you have a combat related feature regarding them? But like, it's very, very gamey language, whereas Powered by the Apocalypse uses very, very narrative language that concerns itself with the state of stories. And I could see, like, I could imagine that might lead to some more argument-y type of situations, depending on the players and the DM. When you guys are trying to determine whether or not a situation is complicated or sketchy or not. So I don't know. I don't really care for the sort of characters and the abilities and how they're all written out and Powered by the Apocalypse. But I really, really like how skill checks are handled, or like just making any checks at all, where everything is done through like moves that your character can perform, and it kind of makes your character act within the genre of the type of story you're trying to tell, or act within the type of trope of like these sort of character things that they are capable of doing. Like fighters and elves are specifically capable of doing like very elfy things, or like fighter-y things like bending bars and breaking open a door. And every single check is done from the like perspective of like how this affects the story. Like when you make a check, if it fails, then depending by how much you fail, it is either like some threat is revealed, or a threat occurs, or like a consequence occurs from your action, or like if you succeed, you succeed and it goes exactly how you thought, or you succeed but it is at a cost. And I do really, really like that language of skill checks, where every skill check is designed to move the story in some direction to some extent, which I think is really, really cool. Whereas GURPS, it's like GURPS doesn't concern itself with the story in the slightest. It cares about how much does your character weigh? How much muscle do you have? How exhausted are you? Have you been fatigued? Have you been doing a lot of physical stuff previously? Okay, well then if you want to break down this door, what is the strength of the hinges? How heavy is the wood? What kind of wood is it made out of? Does the door have any cracks in it? Okay, so you need to make this check or that check, and you either just succeed and you break down the door, or you fail and you might use some more exhaustion, something like that. You might use some of your fatigue, which is just like very, very dull to like roll and just have very literal and physical or like very literal and physical just results occur from your rolls, which is just like very uninteresting. That it always makes the most realistic thing occur as often as it possibly can, whereas Powered by the Apocalypse is like, oh, well, you broke down the door, but you did it in such a way that was very loud, and now everyone has heard you, and they're coming to get you. Or you've, like, failed to break down the door, and you've injured yourself, and that's the consequence that has occurred. And it's just... So yeah, Powered by the Apocalypse, I really like how the game itself is played. I really do not like the characters and character sheet. GURPS, really like the characters, really do not like the gameplay itself. Alright, so what's some other ones I got on here? Feng Shui. So this one I'm going to pop right in the middle of game and narrative, where this does not care about simulating real life at all. Feng Shui is like an action movie, martial arts type of game, where if you try to perform like crazy wild stunts, you will actually get bonuses for trying to do that, rather than like penalties for trying to do things that would be really, really difficult. Like if you try to jump over a burning car with a backflip somersault and like while shooting two guys, that'll be easier than if you just try to do like a running long jump over this burning car. Which I think that can be very fun, just to try to always have the utmost wild nonsense always happen. But I feel like it's kind of got like a novel element to it, or like maybe a little bit gimmicky, where I think of any type of game, this is probably the type of game that'll get oldest the fastest, because when those wild stunts do occur, well, that is now just the norm. That is how every single action is. So it's really not impressive when people do these crazy things. So I think, yeah, Feng Shui, well, I guess I should add 2, because that's the specific version I read. But yeah, I feel like this has the ability to get worn out the absolute soonest, because there's just... people stop caring about exciting things happening, and then like I don't know how much of a game you really have after that. But I feel like for short-term games, like a one-shot or something, or a very short campaign, Feng Shui is like a great game that'll like really, get people into it. I think for like you got to play with people that have some creativity that are like, willing to try to come up with wild things to do. But it does reward that, which is very fun. Okay, so what else have we got? Right, okay. Call of Cthulhu. So this, I think, very totally not concerned with being a fun game at all. It is somewhere between trying to make sure that you are a real life human with the capabilities that a real human could perform, and is trying to tell a story. But yeah, no, there's no like worry about bonus actions in combat in Call of Cthulhu. This is very much so not a game that you're trying to play because you're like missing that rush from Skyrim. There's no you're not gonna try to make a Munchkin power build, like some sort of min-maxed character in Call of Cthulhu. That's just like not gonna happen unless you're trying to pull some old man Henderson nonsense. But that's not really playing Call of Cthulhu. And okay, over here I got Warhammer Fantasy Role Play, where unlike D&D, because of the rules of the game, it doesn't take very long before your character can just like survive 200-foot falls. So like D&D isn't very simulationisty in that sense. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, though, very much so. If you fall from a height of 200 feet, you're gonna end up dying, even if you're the equivalent of a high level character. Like even if you're an archpriest or something, if you fall, you're gonna die. But it's got like a little bit more of a gamist-y aspect because you got like fate points and this sort of like meta currency that you can spend, and like it's definitely not as gamey as D&D because you're not like gaining new abilities every level or whatever. For the most part, all you've got is just walk up to people and attack them. But Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, I'm generally a fan. And what I got in the middle here is World of Darkness. Now, I don't know, that might be a little bit of a controversial place to put World of Darkness, but I think like I've come to realize why I have such a fascination with World of Darkness as a game. Whereas even though I think like in all three of these aspects it's got some kind of sloppy things going on, like I don't think it doesn't do any of these three aspects like particularly well. Like it's not got super fun combat. It's very much so not super realistic for simulationist, and like it doesn't, like the rules of the game are like just concerned enough with narrativist or like being narratively focused at like some of the abilities are kind of confusing and how you actually implement them in a game. But that being said, I think it's got like a good balance of all three of these aspects, and I think that's one of the reasons why I always kind of come back to World of Darkness when I think about what kind of games I'm generally a fan of. So I think it's got like enough of that good character creation with the whole merits and flaws system that like you can actually be like an interesting, like fully fleshed out person and actually gain like mechanical benefits and penalties based off of what kind of a personality you have. And like all the abilities, like in Vampire the Masquerade, the Mesmerize, and basically all of Mage, all the like abilities are not really written from a game perspective of how they work in combat. They are just written in like a way of like what kind of things you can accomplish with mesmerize, like what, or with all the different spheres of mage, like what kind of thing your character can literally do, which again I think makes World of Darkness a can make it a very hard game to actually run, because it does not help the DM in the slightest as to how you should actually like adjudicate all these different abilities and how they should actually, like what results your player actually need to roll in order to have the intended effect. Kind of every single roll you as the DM have to come up with the difficulty of what this check is and whether or not it should actually work this way. But like it also it kind of tries just enough to like tell you like, well, you should be rolling will plus manipulation or whatever for this type of check. And yeah, so in conclusion, I think when I try to like create my own games in the future, I'm going to concern myself less with trying to pick a pre-existing game and sort of make my version of that, and more so, very much so, come at it from the angle of looking at the three different points of RPG design and try to create a balance, because I do think there's, like, obviously each of these have their pros and cons, but I think ultimately I'm a fan of trying to balance all three. Okay, yeah, that's about all I had to say. I just had some things I wanted to work through in my mind concerning RPG design. All right, see ya.